Okay, everybody, this is your lesson on solving percent problems using equations. Now, we previously discussed and I've taught you how to solve percent problems using proportions. And this time around, it's just going to be a little bit different, just using equations. Some of you, I think, in class have already asked about, changing percents to decimals and doing it that way. And um, I've always mentioned that it is, that's a different thing, but if you want to go ahead and do it that way, that's fine. But let's go ahead and get started here. Here's your first example. It says, use an equation to solve. We have 32% of 40 is what number? Okay, so again, we're not going to use our is of method. We're just going to use, or we're going to set up a proportion to help us solve this problem. So the first step is to basically just kind of break it down. Okay, in words, essentially what we have here is a number is 32% of 40. And we're going to let n, right here, we're going to let n equal the number. And set up our equation. N equals 32 hundredths times 40. Now you'll notice at this point right here, you'll notice that we changed the percent into its decimal equivalent. Okay, and to change a percent to a decimal, it's only a matter of dividing by 100, or the simpler way to think of it is just moving the decimal over 2 places to the left. That's always what happens. Decimal moves over 2 places to the left. Some people think, well, if it's 4.2%, 4.2%, they'll say, well, isn't it already a decimal? I don't need to change it to a decimal. But technically, what you still need to do, you still need to move the decimal over 2 places. So it's going to become 0.042. So 42 thousandths, basically, because it moved from here 2 places over. And that's what's going on there, no matter what. If the percent is something like, I don't know, 200%, when you move the decimal over, it becomes 2. The decimal moves here. So don't get thrown off by the fact that if you move the decimal over, it doesn't look like a decimal. It might look like a whole number, and that's okay. The fact is that the decimal moved over 2 places. That's all that needs to happen, is the decimal needs to move over 2 places. So there's your crash lesson on moving decimals over, but I think everyone at this stage of the game knows how to do that. If you don't, please let us know. But here you go. You guys are allowed to use your calculators and solve that. 32 hundredths times 40 equals 12 and 8 tenths. There's your solution. So 12.8. There's your answer. Pretty simple stuff. Some of you might actually prefer this method over the is of method. I think a lot of people do. The only thing is that these can be kind of tricky, especially when we're looking for a percent. So let's go ahead and look at our next example here. And this one is asking us to figure out what 18% of what number is 81. Okay, so 18% of what number is 81. So we're going to let, like usual, we're going to let n equal the number. And we don't know what that is. That's our unknown. 18% of what is 81. So we're going to set this up. And as usual, whenever you have a percent, no matter what, if you're changing it to equation form, you have to change the percent to a decimal. You cannot just leave it 18. If you leave it as 18, your answer might be 100 times bigger than what it needs to be. So make sure you change it to its decimal equivalent, or if you want to, I guess you can change it to a fraction, 18 over 100 or 9 over 50, if you want to do that. But right now we're practicing equations, so let's leave it as a decimal, and that's going to suit us. So 0.18 times n equals 81. Now let's clean this up a little bit, and it's going to look like this. Sorry, I kind of skipped through some stuff here, but basically just making it look like an equation. 18 hundredths n equals 81. Now if you're up on your solving equation business here, you'd know to solve this equation you need to do the inverse. The inverse of right here, this is multiplication. The inverse of multiplication is to divide. And you're going to divide by whatever is on the letter side. So you're going to divide by 0.18. And there you have it. So n equals 450. And that's our answer, 450. 18% of 450 is 81. That seems to make some sense to me there. All right, next example here. Let's do one where we don't have the percent. Okay, percent is missing. Use an equation to solve. What percent of 200 is 45? Here's our setup. I'm just kind of breaking it down. If you see what I'm doing here, you know, the important elements of this problem. A percent of our number is 45. Just want to break it down and look at the important parts of it. So let's let P equal the percent. And in this instance, you might want to use that letter P whenever you're looking for a percent, because these are the trickier problems that you're going to come across, because there's a little bit of an extra step here at the end. You may seem like you're done at the very end, but there's going to be one little extra step that is different from the other two examples I just did with you. So here we go. So P, and I should also point out that oops, sorry. Sorry, I had to sneeze there. So anyway, I had to pause the video. Okay, carrying on here. Let P equal the percent. The equation looks like this. P times 200 equals 45. If we were to clean that up a little bit, you're going to get, 200P. Something that looks like a typical equation that you guys are used to solving. 200P equals 45. Okay, so that's what you want it to do. Want it to look like. So 200P equals 45. Now, what are you going to do to solve this? All right, so what are you going to divide by? Are we going to divide by 200 or are we going to divide by 45? You might be tempted to divide by 45 because that's a smaller number, and that's what you're used to doing. You're used to dividing a bigger number by a smaller number. But the important thing to keep in mind here is that you're always dividing by whatever's with the letter, whatever's next to the letter. So divide by 200. Okay, so we're going to divide by 200 on both sides. So 400 divided by 200, or 45 divided by 200. I know that doesn't seem very natural, it's not something you're used to doing in math, but it's okay. It's okay to divide a smaller number by a much bigger number. That's all right. It's not going to mess things up. Okay, so when you use your calculator, you're going to do 45 divided by 200. You're allowed to use your calculator. It's a good thing here. You just have to know how to use it. And this is your answer that you get out. Okay, and like I said, this is where you have to stop and think, okay, well, I'm figuring out the percent. What did I get? I got a decimal, okay? You got a decimal, and if you got a decimal, that means you got to change it back to a percent, okay? So change it back into a percent by doing what? How do you change a decimal into a percent? Well, when we change it to a decimal, I remember we moved the decimal over 2 places to the left. So I guess if we're going to move it back into a percent, we're going to do the opposite of that, which is move it 2 steps to the right. So you guys are going to move the decimal around that number of steps. Okay, and there you have it, 22.5%. And that, if we were to plug that back in, I know you don't always do this, 6th graders, but just try it out, 22.5%. If you were to think about that just for a second, 22.5% of 200 is 45. That seems to make sense to me. 22.5% is not too far from 25. And 25% is a fourth. And a fourth of 200, a quarter of 200 is 50. And 45 is not that far from 50. So common sense, for thinking about, good number sense here, then that answer, 22.5%, makes perfect number sense. If you made an error with moving over the decimal, perhaps you thought it was 2.25, then you can go, okay, well, that doesn't make sense. Or maybe you move the decimal too far. Let's say you got 225%. That wouldn't make sense either. So always think about your answer. Does it make sense? I know as sixth graders, you just want to be done with things and not be bothered and tell Mr. Gassman, get away from me. I don't need your help. But just make sure you're always asking yourself that question. Does my answer make sense? That's what good mathematicians do. Okay? And why don't you go ahead and do these problems. These problems will be on your flip note sheet, and we'll go over these in class the next time we meet, and that does it. Okay, so that was a lesson on solving percent problems using equations. Okay, so if you understood that, yeah, that might be your preferred method for solving these kind of problems. And if that is true, go ahead. That's great. Use that method. If you like the is of method better, use that. It really doesn't matter. The important thing is that you understand the math and the arithmetic behind what you're doing. Okay? So everyone have a good night, good day, good weekend, whatever you're doing right now. And I'll see you the next time we meet.